Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle with the suspension hanging so the wheel's off the ground. After that, we're going to move along to removing our center cover. If you were to feel along it, you're going to find an area that you can carefully get in between with a small pry bar. Once you have that cover off of there, continue on to removing all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, the next thing we're going to do is start removing the sway bar link from the area. Now you're going to find that you have a bolt that comes up through the center of this area here and makes its way all the way up to the top where it has an 18mm headed nut holding it in place. I'll use an 18mm wrench to hold that nut and a 16mm down along the bottom to go ahead and turn the entire bolt. So now we can take this apart. I already removed the nut. I'm going to go ahead and remove the top washer. We can remove the top bushing. And now you just want to go ahead and take something and drive this down and out of here. As you bring it down, you're going to be removing the bushing, the washer, this sleeve, and then the bushing and washer from the bottom as well. Just wiggle that bolt around on the bottom there. It's common for the bolt to be stuck inside the sleeve due to rust or something the like. So I'm just going to go ahead and hold the sleeve with some locking pliers. I'll use some penetrant to try to get inside the center, and then I'll just try to working this out. Almost there. You can tell that it's very rusted. There's the sleeve that goes over the top. Reach down here, I'll grab the washer and the bushing, pull those off of there. Now we can remove the rest of the sway bar link from the area. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is carefully put something underneath the lower control arm just to apply a little bit of upward pressure so we can continue by removing the front shock from the lower control arm. Looking underneath the control arm, you can see that you have 2 studs that protrude from the shock through the control arm. They're held on by 2 13mm headed nuts. Let's remove the pair. Now let's go ahead and start lowering this down a little bit. What we're looking for is to see the 2 studs come dropping out of that lower control arm. There we are. Just going to use a pry bar. I'll carefully try pulling down on the upper control arm just to try to separate the lower from the shock. Okay, so now that we have the bottom of the shock dismounted from the control arm, let's go up a little higher with this so we can start dismounting the lower ball joint from the knuckle. To start removing the ball joint from the knuckle, I'm going to apply a little bit of pressure underneath the control arm. Now we'll continue on to removing the cotter pin here. I'll use some cutters, cut this right out of here, and then we'll remove the mounting nut. Now let's use a 1-inch socket to go ahead and remove this. Now we can separate the ball joint from the knuckle using a pickle fork and a hammer. Okay, so now what we need to do is go ahead and try pulling down on this knuckle a little bit. I want to separate the ball joint from the area and gently pull this away. Okay, so we have the ball joint separated from the knuckle. Now we're going to go ahead and follow this torsion bar all the way to its rearward mounting point. You're going to find an adjustment cam bolt right here. Don't touch that yet. You need to go ahead and make sure that you mark it before you go ahead and loosen this, which is going to, of course, take torsion off of the lower control arm. We're going to continue by re-lowering that lower control arm. Now we're going to continue by removing this bracket. You're going to find 4 13mm headed bolts, 2 along the bottom, and then if you were to look along the outer aspect of this, you'll find 2 more. We'll get to those. Make sure you hold that bracket for this last one. Now that we have that shield off of here, we're going to continue with a nice crayon. You can also use paint or whatever you might happen to have, such as nail polish, and you just want to make your way along this area where the threads are on this adjustment bolt. The reason why we're doing this is because when we put it back together, I want to try to put it back to its original position. Of course, we will still have to get a 4-wheel alignment when we're done, but at least as long as it's as close as possible, we should be good for now. Now the next thing we're going to do is pause with this adjustment. Typically, you don't even have to really make too much of an adjustment here, but what you do want to do is make sure that you hold this in the upright position while we continue by removing the rest of the control arm up along the front. You can put a bar underneath this or whatever you might happen to have. I'm just going to use a ratchet strap. We'll make our way to this rearward mounting bolt. I'm going to use a 21mm, start turning this bolt out. On the forward side, there's a nut that has a little tab that goes up and into the frame. If you were to look at this one, it looks pretty much the same. Comes right up there, and it's a captured nut. Now we'll do the same on the front here. Now let's take out our rearward support. Up on top of this area, you have this bracket. You want to make sure you take it off, give it a good inspection, make sure it's still solid. That feels good. Now we're just going to grab onto this, we'll give it a little wiggle, and we're going to try to separate it. What you're going to notice is it only comes out a little bit. That's because this torsion bar goes straight across to the control arm. So at this point, we need to go ahead and grab onto the control arm, remove both of our mounting bolts, and then lower the entire thing down to the ground so we can continue. Now, as we start removing our last lower bolt, you want to keep in mind that this is going to be extremely heavy. Not only do you have the weight of the large lower control arm, but you also have the full weight of the torsion bar, and that makes its way all the way towards the center of the vehicle. It's going to be awkward and heavy. If you need a second person, go ahead and grab help. Now with this back on the ground, we're going to get ready to prepare our brand new control arm. I have this put right next to the original control arm. I want to make sure that it matches up and it's the same exact shape. Essentially, I want to make sure I don't have the wrong control arm. Now with that said, before I go ahead and take the torsion bar out of the original, I'm going to come right inside this port right here where the torsion bar is supposed to go in the new control arm. Just go ahead and apply some sort of lubricant, possibly a Never Seez or even a little bit of grease if you have some. Essentially just to make sure the torsion bar doesn't get stuck in there in the future. Now what we want to do is grab onto the torsion bar and we're going to separate it from the control arm. You're going to see it come apart from right here and slide right on out of the rearward hole as well. Once we have it out, you want to make sure you have it in the same exact position. So pay attention to this area down here. You can see while it's in the control arm, in the position on the floor, this is aiming up at an angle. When you go to put it in, make sure it's not facing in the wrong direction or else you're going to have some major issues. Once you have it out of there, you want to go ahead and wipe this down, give it a thorough inspection. Looking at this, I can tell it's not rotted, broken, cracked, or damaged in any way. It looks perfect, so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the brand new control arm. There we are. As you can tell, I'm at the same angle as when I had removed it. Now we can go ahead and get this all back into the vehicle. Before we put the control arm up there, go ahead and have a look at the mounting bolts. You want to make sure you clean down the threads, and I always apply a thin amount of red thread locker along each of the threaded areas. Now we can start putting this in position. We're paying attention to the adjustment point along the back. Once that's up there, we're also going to go ahead and line up the forward aspect. Now we can put the nuts on here. We want to pay attention to this area. You can see one of them has a much larger clip on it. The one with the larger clip goes to the front. Go ahead and put that right into the frame up there, swing it down onto the bolt. Turn the bolt and snug it up. For these, you want to make sure that you leave them loose. You do not need to tighten these yet. We will later. Let's get the plate up in here. Now what we want to do is swing the torsion bar up and try to put it in position on that plate. Once I have it up there, I'm going to continue with my ratchet strap across here just to hold it in position while I make my way back to the control arm. Now I'm just going to go ahead and pivot this ball joint stud a little bit. And then what we need to pay attention to is the shock. You can see it up through this hole. What I want to do is try to pull it aside. So it's going to cause no pressure on that control arm while I raise the lower control arm a little bit more. At this point, we have plenty of pressure underneath the control arm. You can tell that I'm about to clear this area of the knuckle, so this can fall right into position. Let's pause in the front, follow that torsion bar all the way to the back. We're going to remove our clamp from this area. Now we got lucky back here. we didn't have to make any adjustments, and that's a good thing. Now with that said, let's go ahead and take our shield. We'll put it right up in here. I'm going to start in all 4 of my 13mm headed mounting bolts. Once they're all started, we can go ahead and bottom them out and make sure they're snug. Let's move back up to the front, and we're going to start lowering the ball joint down into the knuckle. Be very careful that it doesn't get caught and bind up in any way. Let's put this bottom nut on here, and then we're going to torque it to 98 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, you need to pay attention to the stud of the ball joint. On the stud, you're going to find that it has a hole that goes directly through the center. You want to make sure that that hole lines up with one of the holes or slots that's on the mounting nut. If it isn't, continue tightening until the very next slot does. I've got this perfectly lined up. I'm going to continue on with a brand new cotter pin. We'll slide it right on through there and pin it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on its own. Perfect. All right, so now that we have the ball joint torqued, we're going to carefully put pressure underneath the control arm again. I want to start lifting this up into ride height position. Essentially, it would be as if the vehicle's weight is on the ground. The suspension would be in the upright position, and then we can go ahead and tighten both of our mounting bolts for the lower control arm. Get this one. Now we're going to torque each of these bolts to 148 foot-pounds. At this point, we're going to carefully either raise or lower the control arm until we can match the shock up with its mounting positions in the control arm. We'll make sure that our hardware makes its way through the control arm as it should. After that, you're going to want to go ahead and put on your locking washers and nuts. My locking washer up on there. Now I'm just going to go ahead and hold the top bolt with a 14mm wrench. Once I have that being held, I'll continue with a 13mm socket to tighten the nut. Do the same to the other one. After we have both of them snug, we'll go ahead and torque those to 18 foot-pounds. Let's get the pressure out from underneath this control arm so we can torque that shock. All right, so let's go ahead and start putting in our sway bar link. I'm going to leave it so I have the entire long bolt. I also have one of my washers with the concave area facing upward towards this bushing. I'll slide the bushing down and you can see that I have the little nub sticking up. that nub is going to be fitting up against the bottom of the control arm. I'll go ahead and slide this up a little bit. Now I'm going to continue on to another one of my rubber bushings. We're going to put it so the little nub is facing towards the control arm. Now we'll take one of our washers. You know which way it's going to go, so the concave area is facing towards the bushing itself. Now let's move along to our large spacer. Another washer. That one's going to be facing with the concave area facing towards where the bushing will be. Bushing with the nub facing up towards where the sway bar is going to be. Now at this point, we're going to have to go ahead and try to move this sway bar up a little bit so we can slide this under. If you are doing these as a pair, you can just go ahead and go over to the other side of the vehicle and release that side as well, and that'll make it so you can bring this up and down. To lift this sway bar, I'll just stick a pry bar underneath the sway bar and up against the frame. At this point, I'm going to gently pry. While I'm doing this, I want to be extremely careful in case it slips so I don't hurt myself. Time for another rubber bushing. Put it so the nub's facing towards the sway bar. Your concave washer facing down. And your locking nut. Now it's going to be time to go ahead and tighten up our sway bar link. Now when you're tightening your sway bar link, you only want to tighten it until the point that you can see that your bushings are touching up against either the sway bar itself or even against the control arm. Essentially the areas that it's supposed to touch against, it's supposed to touch, but it's not necessarily supposed to be squished down flat like a pancake. As you can tell, this is touching everywhere it needs to be. At this point, you'd want to go ahead and do the same on the other side of the vehicle. Now let's go ahead and put the wheel back up on here. We'll start on all 5 of our 19mm lug nuts. Bottom them out, get the wheels safely back on the ground, and then torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. We've got the wheel back on the ground. Let's torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Of course, if you have a center cover, go ahead and put that on now. Looking at the back of it, you're going to find you have one area that protrudes looking like this. That needs to fit into any of your lug nut holes. Okay friends, we got our front control arm installed in the vehicle. At this point, you're going to want to go ahead and take it for a road test. You want to make sure you don't hear any funny noises, you don't have an ABS light, and of course you get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.